Welcome to Gospel Life Church. We're so glad you're here. Before Pastor Chase starts, there are a couple things we want to show you. From the online services site, if you click the Connect button, it will take you to a page that has ways for you to communicate with us. Any guest that fills out this connection card will receive a $5 gift card, and Gospel Life will give a donation to help families who've been affected by COVID-19. Next, if you click on the Help button, it will take you to a page where you can either request help or find out how you can give help. On the page, there's a button you click if someone you know or if you yourself need help during this time. Below, there are 3 ways you can help local families, whether it's through donating money, giving gift cards, or by volunteering to run errands. If you click this, it will take you to our donate page. And if you select benevolence, 100% of what's given will go directly to help local families that have been affected by COVID-19. We hope that you enjoy our service today. Our reading for the message this morning is found in Mark 10, verses 42 through 52. And Jesus called them to him and said to them, "You know that those who are considered rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them. But it shall not be so among you. But whoever would be great among you must be your servant. And whoever would be first among you must be slave of all. For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and give his life as a ransom for many." And they came to Jericho, and as he was leaving Jericho with his disciples and a great crowd, Bartimaeus, a blind beggar, the son of Timaeus, was sitting by the roadside. And when he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to cry out and say, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." And many rebuked him, telling him to be silent. But he cried out all the more, "Son of David, have mercy on me." And Jesus stopped and said, "Call him." And they called the blind man, saying to him, "Take heart, get up, he is calling you." And throwing off his cloak, he sprang up and came to Jesus. And Jesus said to him, "What do you want me to do for you?" And the blind man said to him, "Rabbi, let me recover my sight." And Jesus said to him, "Go your way, your faith has made you well." And immediately he recovered his sight and followed him on the way. This is the word of the Lord.
Good morning. So glad you're with us this morning. And so just as we begin, I just have a question for you. If you're like me, you maybe like books, you like movies, and have you ever been in the midst of a good book or a great movie, and a character in that story they're so blind to some truth that you are, as the audience, totally aware of, right? Like, for instance, like Juliet, right? We as the audience know that she's taken a potion to where she's not really dead. She looks like she's dead, but she's not. But Romeo is blinded to this fact, and he comes in, he sees her, and he toasts, so to speak, with poison in his hand to his beloved, and he says, "Here's to my love, thus with a kiss I die," and he commits suicide. What a tragedy that is, that he's so blinded to this reality. Or perhaps I have a toddler, and she's also a girl, and so we watch a lot of Frozen, right? And so Princess Anna, right? I love that doesn't remember being struck in the head with Elsa's magic, but what she does know is that her sister is completely cold to her. She remembers all of the fun they had together, but she's completely cold and distant, and she just wonders, like, why? And of course, as the audience, we know, like, it's Elsa's best way to try to, social distance herself from her, so to speak, right? And to protect her and to keep her safe. Or like in a scary movie, You're there, you're watching it. The character goes into the house they think is empty, but the killer, we all know the killer's there. And if you're like me, from behind a pillow or perhaps inside of a blanket, you're screaming as loud as you can, "He's right behind you. Look behind you," right? Like perhaps, something of that nature. Or maybe, again, I'm a dad with toddlers. So Steve from Blue's Clues, right? He's looking for the next clue, and he's like, let me think about this now. Now, where is the next clue? Where do you think it is? And the blue paw print is completely and obviously on the orange ball. But Steve has to wait for the toddlers to give him the obvious answer, that it's on the orange ball, right? The author of this biography of Jesus, Mark, that we're in this morning, is kind of doing a similar thing. We, the audience, have an answer to really who this guy is, this guy Jesus. But here, the author is kind of using the same sense of literary irony to help us understand a point that we don't all see the way we think we see. And we're kind of blinded sometimes to the realities that is. And the question that prevails throughout the entirety of Mark, this biography of Jesus' life, is this question: who is this guy? Like in reality, like who in the world is this guy? I mean, he heals someone, right? And that question is asked: who is this guy who can heal the incurable? Or he takes a kid's Lunchable and he feeds over 5,000 people, and they wonder to themselves, who is this guy who can cater a meal for thousands from basically nothing? He encounters someone provoked by corrupt religious leaders, and he confronts them, and they back down. And so everyone asks the question, who is this guy who stands up for those who cannot stand up for themselves, who stands against injustices? He teaches, and they wonder, who is this guy who teaches with such authority and who is unlike anyone we've ever heard before? The author is pointing to this kind of idea here. All of us can so easily miss the point. And what's interesting about the section of this biography we're in, these true stories that are happening in between, they're kind of bookended by two stories, and they're both stories about blind guys. These two different blind men who encounter Jesus and have their sight restored to them. And so thus, we find ourselves in this midst of, are we too unable to see the reality of who Jesus is? So as we've read already this morning, we're going to go to chapter 10. And starting in verse 32, he says this. He says, not 32, 42, excuse me. And he says this. He says, Jesus called to them and said to them, "You know that those who are considered rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them. But it shall not be so among you," right? "But whoever would be great among you must be your servant, and whoever would be first among you must be slave of all." And this is the real key that I want us to point to this morning, is for even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. So the answer from our author here is this answer of, who is this Jesus guy? Who is this guy? The answer is, he's the Son of God. Now, for some of us, we're like, oh, what does that mean? Well, in a sense, what Mark is saying and what they would have understood in first century Palestine was this, that he's basically saying, this is God in the flesh. He's come down to rescue us. Now, they were waiting for a rescuer. They were waiting for what they call the Messiah, someone who was going to come and usher in peace and tranquility and order, and he was going to make sense of all of it and enact justice on the world, and he was going to come in. Now, for them, they understood that to be some kind of physical, kind of warrior king who was going to come in and thwart the evil Roman Empire. But Jesus has a different plan in mind. He came not to rescue the evil from without, but instead it's about the evil within. And he talks a lot about the idea of the heart and where those things, where the evil actually comes from. And it's from the center, from the inner self. It's from us, from our hearts. So, and it's this idea that there is a great propensity for us as human beings to want to save ourselves. We love that idea of saving themselves. Again, I talked about myself being a dad of a toddler, and my 4-year-old right now, she has this one statement, and if you have a toddler or a little kid right now, you know this: I can do it myself, like all the time. Like whatever it is, whether it be tying her shoes, although she has Velcro shoes, she doesn't really tie them, but still putting them on, right? And they're often found to be on the wrong feet, but hey, she did it herself, so hooray, or whether it be opening the door or whatever the case may be, the reality is they're just saying, I can do it myself. And there's this propensity in us to think we can do it ourselves. And for them, these people living in first century Palestine, for them living in really a super religious culture, they had no problem with the idea that they weren't good enough and they needed to change their ways. They just didn't understand that it wasn't them trying to change their ways that was really the case that could really change things for them. It was instead God had to come in and intervene and do something for them they couldn't do for themselves. In their religious minds, whether they were Jewish or like the Greeks and the Romans, they would have been more that they believed in the gods or the goddesses, whatever the case may have been. For this person reading this at this time, they would have never dreamt about a God who would come down to earth and lay his life down for them. That would have never even been an imagination they could have dreamt up, because the reality was they saw the gods as these wrathful, vengeful, sometimes even vindictive gods. And so their best attempts to do things, they would make sacrifices, they would do things their goal was to really shield themselves from the wrath of God. And for the Jewish men and women, it was similar. They may not have sacrificed children to that extent, but still their sacrifices, their religious deeds, all the things they put in place to make themselves kind of shielded from the wrath of God and hopeful that they would make him happy. And so a farmer then would go and do the right things, wherever they landed in that spiritual demographic we just discussed, right? And the farmer would go and he would make the right sacrifices at the right time, hoping that God would be happy with him and bless him and give him better crops. Right, or the mom and the dad would go and they would make the right kind of sacrifices, so they'd be fertile and they would be able to have lots of children to take care of those crops, right? Whatever the case may be, like they were pursuing this idea of shielding themselves from this wrathful, vengeful God who they just hoped they could make happy somehow. And you know what? Today, the truth kind of still remains, though, for us, right? Like, as we really think through this idea of who is Jesus and how does he fit with me? And maybe you're kind of asking those questions at this point. The reality is, like, it's still true for us today. Maybe the questions look a little different, but the idea of wrath and evil in our hearts, that's foreign to us. But the idea of being good enough, like, we kind of get that, right? Like, we're maybe hoping that if we do enough good, like, it'll give us a fighting chance to get to heaven, or give us a fighting chance to be happy, or give us a fighting chance to have a good life to the extent where we can have maybe a nice bank account or a nice family, or we can just have peace, or whatever the case may be. Like if we just do enough good, we can get on board with something like that. And so yeah, it may make sense. Like we don't see God as being wrathful like these guys would have, but we still also see this idea of, have I done enough? Have I done enough good? But here's the question I have for you this morning as we kind of dig into this idea of who Jesus is. Who is this guy, and why has he got to be this substitute sacrifice for me? What if our good isn't good enough? That's a question a lot of people have asked before. I'm not the first person to ask that question, but what if even our best attempts to do good for others are actually just have selfish components to them? Because if it is our deeds, our good deeds that we're doing, maybe even for others, that will actually give us access to heaven, happiness, nirvana, whatever the thing we're looking for is, would those deeds still be good? Doesn't this prove that the evil in our hearts still persists and needs to be eradicated? Like there's still this self-interest, this still looking to myself, putting myself at the center of the universe that is actually keeping me from being who I was meant to be. So in reality, if we do something selfless to gain something, is it really selfless? Isn't it selfish? And so here we come to this statement by Jesus, and Jesus kind of points that out. He says, listen, when people are given authority, this is like the default human experience. When we're given authority, often we misuse it and we abuse it. And hey, we see that all the time, right? We see the idea of the abuse of power here today, and this idea that if I have it, I don't want to give it up. And if I have to give it up, I'm not going to give it to those who don't deserve it. Like there's this reality of like hoarding and holding on to power to the extent where it's all about us. Which again, that irony of Jesus here, the one who, as the Bible describes him, the one who can create something from nothing, the one who has all the power in the universe, is now saying to us, he's saying, listen, here's the way. The way is you serve even though you deserve to be served. And then he says this, and here's the reality. I did not come to be served, but to serve. I came to give my life as a ransom for many. That's verse 45 there, here in Mark's biography of Jesus, chapter 10. So this idea of humble faith then. And if you're like me, I hate it when somebody tries to pay for my meal. Like, you ever been there, like you're sitting there and, hey, I've worked hard for the money I have, and I'm sitting there and I've got my family around me, and my dad's like, hey, Chase, I got the, and I'm like, no, hold on. You don't need to pay for me. I'm a big boy. I got this. And there just seems to be this pride in me to receive things like that, right? And I'm not talking about like to receive a gift. I think there has to be somewhat of a laying down of pride. Now, here's what I'm not talking about holidays, birthdays, things like that, where we've kind of given ourselves permission to receive gifts. I'm talking about receiving something that's unexpected. A gift that's given to you that you don't expect. How do we respond? And there's a pastor up in New York. His name's Tim Keller, and here's what he says. He says, what is the only way, the only one thing that prevents us from receiving a gift? It's pride. To receive an unexpected gift, we have to lay down some pride. We have to be willing to say, even though I don't feel like I deserve this, I haven't earned this, I'm going to set that aside for a moment. I'm going to receive something. And I think part of that comes down to this idea of like, I don't want to be indebted to somebody, right? Like, I don't want to owe them. I don't want to feel guilty when I see them and be like, oh man, like they gave me that thing or they bought that thing for me, and I never even sent them a thank you card. And like this reality of like, am I really, I feel indebted to them. And I think that same thing when we talk about Jesus laying his life down for us, there does seem to be this sense of like, I don't want to receive that because, like I don't want to be indebted to him. Like, why does he have to do that for me? Like, I don't need that. Or for instance, just like that check, somebody paying for your dinner, like, listen, I can pay for myself. And this is exactly why Jesus came. The reality is that's our default. We feel like we can do it ourselves. Much like my 4-year-old daughter, I got this. And even though our shoes are on backwards and our shirt is, we got our head through the sleeve hole in our shirt, we're good because at least we did it ourselves. And that's kind of where we're at as human beings. Like, we think we got this. And then there's this idea of faith too that we'll get to here in a moment, but the willingness to believe in the gift giver, that he's legitimate, that he doesn't want something from us necessarily, that he's legitimately and genuinely doing this because he cares for us. Like, that's hard to lay those things down, and we'll talk about that more. But this is more than just buying our dinner, right? It's more than that. When Jesus came, Jesus set aside his right to be served and laid his life down as a ransom for us. He was choosing to be our substitute. In essence, it was either us or him, and he chose to lay his life down instead. And the question that I think came to my heart when I was thinking through this was this idea of like, why would Jesus actually do this? And it's a really simple answer, but there's a lot of depth to this. It's this idea that love is the reason. I mean, have you ever truly loved someone? The idea of being a substitutionary, sacrificial love that Jesus is talking about here. Have you ever truly loved someone who wasn't perfectly capable of taking care of themselves? Right? Some relationship where they're perhaps emotionally damaged. There's something going on in their hearts. They're wounded. they're emotionally hurt, whatever the case may be, and they come to you, and now you have a relationship with them, and it's kind of a one-sided thing, isn't it? There's a cost to that. There's a cost to loving someone who isn't capable of taking care of themselves. Again, I mentioned my kids. Taking care of kids is this way. I think about when I was a teenager. Like when I think about 11-year-old, although it wasn't quite a teenager, but middle school Chase through high school Chase. Like, dude, I was a self-serving jerk. It's the only way I can put it. Like, I don't know that I would have been okay being my dad. Like, I was kind of a punk, right? But my parents loved me, and they were willing to pay the cost of dealing with the jerkiness that was me, the emotional wreck that I was, this self-serving punk that would come in and think that he deserved everything, and they were willing to put up with that because they loved me. And I think about who I would be today, the kind of husband and dad I would be if it wasn't for my parents loving me through that. Like, who would I be? Where would I be? It just doesn't make any sense. This kind of love can be exhausting. It can zap the energy right out of us. That's the cost that we pay with loving someone through this. That, as I said, who would we be? Where would we be without a friend willing to step in and love us to the point of healing? It's draining. It takes a level of emptying out of ourselves to love someone in that state. And as Jesus here is talking about, it takes a truly substitutionary, sacrificial love. I mentioned favorite books, favorite movies, all right? And so Harry Potter is like definitely up there in my list. I love them. And they're just, I know they're written for children, but they're just beautifully, beautifully done. And they captivate me. And I just love the idea of it. And here is one of my favorite books is the first one. And the first one, in these stories, we find there's a few times we see characters do this kind of substitutionary, self-sacrificing kind of love that Jesus is talking about here. And so Harry Potter, in the very first one, he finds out that about his parents and what took place. And at the very end of the movie, Harry's there, and there's this Lord Voldemort kind of possesses this guy named Professor Quirrell. And Professor Quirrell's coming after Harry, and he puts his hands on Harry. When he does, he starts to burn, and it's a terrible pain. And eventually, he just kind of disintegrates right in front of Harry. And Lord Voldemort at that point is thwarted for that specific story, and at that point. And Harry's like wondering about this, and so what we find out is that Harry's mom, when Harry's just a baby and Lord Voldemort is coming there to kill him, right? In the story, if you haven't heard this, and this is like running it for you, I'm sorry, this has been out for a long time, so spoiler alert here. Lord Voldemort steps in, and he's going to kill Harry because Harry's the one person apparently that can kill him. And his mom steps in because of her love for Harry, and she sacrifices her life for Harry. And so therefore, when Voldemort tries to get him with the curse, all that's left is a scar on Harry, and Lord Voldemort he just evaporates and almost dies. And Harry's wondering about this, and he's talking to his mentor, Professor Dumbledore, and Dumbledore talks about this idea of the power of his mom's love. That it was so indelible, it left such a mark on Harry, not a physical one, but a mark that so much so that when evil would come towards him, that it would literally be thwarted. Why? Because of that love. It left such a powerful mark. And we think about this idea of Jesus coming to die for us and saying, I'll step in and I'll be your substitute. I'll pay the penalty that you owe. There's a power to that. It can be a game changer for us because it changes us from being, I'm indebted, like I owe something to Jesus, but instead it flips the script and say, I don't owe anything to him other than I want to follow him because of the love that he showed to me. And so we've answered the question why Jesus would die, but we haven't answered the question why he had to die. So real quickly here, why did Jesus have to die? And if you're like me, you might be thinking this, like, man, why didn't God just forgive everyone? You know, why didn't he just we'll forgive it, right? And with that, there's kind of this idea of like, have I really done that much to God to where he's that mad at me, where he has to, like it requires my life? Like the things that I've done, it doesn't seem fair and it doesn't seem right. I get that for some people, but for me, I don't feel like I've done that much bad. So why is God so mad at me that it requires this? And on the surface, those questions seem kind of faith-shattering kinds of questions. Yeah, that kind of makes sense. But when we really dive into them, they actually, they carry with it an idea. And I think it's this, that there's an idea that humanity has the things they've done to God are kind of trivial. Going 10 over the speed limit, 4-year-old self taking a sucker from Chuck E. Cheese and kind of taking that home and then mom catching you, or maybe lying about doing your homework, or calling in sick to work when you're not really sick, right? Those are just a few things I've done in my life, okay? As though we really haven't done anything worth saving. That's kind of what we're saying. It's just trivial stuff, right? But let's just quickly dive into the idea of why did Jesus have to die? And the first one you're going to expect me to say, and it's this, the idea of justice. There is something in us, isn't there, to want justice to be done. Even my 4-year-old and my 9-year-old, they want justice to happen. When wrong has been done to them, they want something done about it. They may not always know the answer to it, but they want something done. They want it to be satisfied because there's something about it where they can't take it. And there is that human experience, the idea of justice. We want injustices taken care of. And by the way, the Christian worldview is the only one which really carries out this idea of true justice. But with this idea that humanity then, why justice has to be done is because humanity carries with it from the first sin a hereditary sickness that's fatal. So it's hereditary in the sense that it doesn't matter how much you exercise, doesn't matter how well you eat, doesn't matter how well you're active and all these things. It doesn't matter, because at the end of the day, it's in you and it's fatal, right? You can't go to church enough, you can't do enough good, you can't read enough of the Bible, you can't pray enough, you can't watch enough of Chase's sermons, whatever it is, you can't do enough of that to fix it because it's in you. You can't hide from it. And we've talked about this a little bit already, but one great example of this is the way of the world. We seek ourselves and seek to put ourselves at the center of everything. So even our doing good, it's about us. And Jesus talks about this. Look at verse 42. It says, "You know that those who are considered rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them." There's just this sense of it being all about me. And that's just one example of the world we live in, where injustices are taking place and where even at our best, or maybe our worst, however you want to frame that, something has to be done with it. So our wrongs against each other too are wrongs against God. The reality is the things that we do to others are actually wrongs against God. Why? Because the second idea is this, is that we are his creation. That because we bear his image, we're mirrors of who he is as just being humans. That when wrong is done against us, it's as though it's being done against him. And that's the second idea too, is that we are his creation. The reason why Jesus had to die is because he wanted to win back his creation. He's willing to pay the price, and it's a high price because you and I, we are valuable to him because we're his creation. And he's willing to pay whatever price it took to win us back. The third is this idea of the standard of perfection. I think sometimes when we think about the afterlife, we think about what's going to happen after we die and whether or not we get into heaven or whatever that looks like for us, right? Where we go after that, our eternity. We wonder this question, what's going to happen? And this is, again, this idea of justice. Christianity talks about the idea, Christian worldview is the only one that really metes out justice as it ought to be, where people actually pay for it. And so it presents this idea of this throne room, this judgment, this judge on a seat, and he's judging humanity. And it says great and small, everyone will be there, and everyone will give an account for what they've done. And the reality is, it's not as though I'm going to be compared to this person or this person, right? And just hopefully I'm somehow, I'm equal to them, or I measure up on some level, or perhaps like there's some score I have to hit by doing enough good, like I'm good and my bad are measured against one another. There's an algorithm which calculates my points, and if I hit the right score, then I get in, and if I don't, I go somewhere else, go to the bad place, right? A little nod to the good place, right? The reality is like, then how are we judged? We're judged against God himself. And here's the thing, it's pass or fail. We don't measure up. None of us do, right? Either you measure up or you don't. So why did Jesus have to die? Because of justice, because we're his creation, because of the standard is perfection, and only he could pay the price and make a way for us to then become perfect. Not now, but eventually. And to receive his perfect sacrifice upon our lives, and for him to stand in our stead and stand with us at that judgment seat and say, I've paid for this. The penalty has been paid. And furthermore, to cover our shame. Every one of us has done some shameful things in our lives we're ashamed of, or things that have been done to us are shameful. And Jesus right here is meeting us there and saying, hey, I'll cover that too. I'll cover your shame. I got this. And so we can come with our shame, and we can lay it at the foot of the cross, and he says, I'll pay for that too. And we can find healing there. I find it interesting we ask this question, why? Like have I really done enough bad? But here's the other side to that story, and here's the good news of this, is that it may seem like God's being kind of mean, maybe, for you. Maybe you feel that right now. And you're like, man, like God just needs to lighten up a little bit. Like this seems pretty tough. But here's the thing. Even if that's true, which there's more to it than that, right? He's the God who sees it all. He understands it all. But even if that is true, he paid for it himself. He put his own son on that cross to pay for it, right? He was willing to do that. So you didn't have to pay for it. So yes, the price is high, yet he's the one who paid the price. Which comes to the story of blind Bart. And we've read it already, but I just want to go there just for a second. So here's Bartimaeus, and he's sitting there. He's this blind guy, right? And he's sitting there, and he's blind, and he's begging, and there's no hope for him. And then, by happenstance, maybe, we'll talk about that here in a second, about how it wasn't. But in a chance of fate, Jesus walks by, and at this point, Bartimaeus he's been blind, so his hearing sense has been specially honed, and it's especially sensitive, and so he can hear the whispers of the name of Jesus. He can hear the footsteps coming up. He can hear Jesus' voice above all others. And I imagine the scene of here comes Jesus from like some kind of a restaurant, and the paparazzi are there, and everybody's crowding in. And there are these great crowds, and it's loud, and then they hear this cry above all the other voices. Jesus, right? As loud as it can be. So much so that people are like hushing him and like shoving him back and like, dude, chill out. Like, just let him be. And he continues to yell, and Jesus calls him over. And I love the way it describes it here, where it says that they called the blind man saying, take heart, get up. He's calling you. In verse 50, and throwing off his cloak, he sprang up and he came to Jesus. There was just like this faith and this boldness just to come right to Jesus. And they have a conversation. And in faith, Jesus asks him, what do you want? He says, I want my sight. And Jesus says, your faith has made you see. And then Bart doesn't walk away with just being happy with his own sight. His life has been changed, but his life is going to fully change as he follows Jesus. Where not only his physical blindness has been healed, but his spiritual blindness now is being healed as he follows Jesus. I find it interesting here in Mark, they give the names of Bartimaeus. You want to know why they do that? Because when this was written, these are people you could go talk to. These were eyewitness accounts. They give very specific people. Why? Because Bartimaeus was still following. You can go talk to Bart. He'll tell you all about what took place. I find it interesting that he does that. And so here we find this story. The followers of Jesus, they didn't get it, but the author is also kind of pointing to us and saying, you don't get it either. Like, none of us really get it. We're reaching in the dark and we need a hand to guide us, or maybe someone to actually change our blindness into seeing. We are Bart, right? That felt very, kind of Walking Dead there, like we are Negan, right? Like, but that's exactly what he said. Like, we all are Bartimaeus. We are all right there. Mark is saying that here in his biography. Like Bart, here comes Jesus, and he's with us today. He's right here with us. This is not a coincidence. It's something that is planned by Jesus, and he's talking to you and I today. And he's saying, I'm right here. I'm there with your worry. I'm there with your concerns. I'm there with you when you're hurting. I'm there with you when you're grieving. I'm there with you when you're in pain. I am with you. And Jesus then is calling us over past the barriers that may be in between us in this idea of following him in faith. And he's offering us this incredible gift of salvation. And there's kind of a choice we have to make here at this point. We have this choice, so we can say, hey, Jesus, I know you paid for it, but can I give the tip? That's something I try to pull every time because I feel guilty, right? But Jesus says, no, I got this. You don't owe me anything in a sense that you owe me. You're indebted to me. Instead, it's something you get to do. You become like me, and in becoming like me, you're going to want to do things like I do. Or you can just say, I know you paid for it, Jesus, but I want to pay too, and the waiter gets a double tip. I don't know. But the reality is, right, where are you at with that? Are you willing to receive this incredible gift, even though, man, it's hard, laying down your pride enough and trusting in faith the gift giver, that he has for you your good and his glory because he loves you? Or perhaps for some of us, we've done that. Our spiritual blindness has been healed, but now, you know what? We're in these circumstances, and I think all of us can admit this right now with what's going on in the world right now in this moment. There's a reason why we're having to do this online this morning, right? And there's real fear, and there's real worry, and there's a lot of unknowns. And even though we've received that gift of salvation and he's made us, but yet we still go back to that blindness so easily. And we forget how he rescued us. We forget the one who rescued us from our sins is the same one who's going to rescue us from our worries and our concerns today. So a couple of things for us this morning. Perhaps for you, you want to receive that free gift of salvation. You want to know what that means. And so here's what I'm going to tell you to do here as we conclude, and I'll pray here in just a second. But on our page there, if you're there on our hosting site where you're watching the video, and you'll see up in the right-hand corner, there's a thing that says connection. You can click on that. It's an additional window. You can do that through your phone as well. And on there is a connection card. We talked about that a little while ago earlier in the service. And this is an opportunity for you just to express and communicate, hey, I want to know more about these things. So in there, you can give us some contact information, and we can start the conversation about what it means to have a relationship with God. You can check that mark there as well. Or perhaps for some of us, living blindly to God being in control this morning. We go back to that blindness, right? So for some of us, this, as I said, he's able to take care of our sins, just like he's able to take care of our sins. He can take care of our worries. That's right. But for you, maybe you have some prayer requests that you're just asking God to do some things. And so that's another way on that connection card. You can communicate things you're concerned about, worries you have, people you love that you're concerned for, that you would like us to pray for. Maybe you have questions about following Jesus, ways you can get connected to a gospel community. That's where you can communicate to us as well. And that's a way that you can respond this morning. But wherever you are, may we lay down our pride this morning at the foot of the cross and trust the giver in faith. Trust the giver, the gift giver, that he knows best and that he loves us enough to pay for our sins. And he therefore he's good enough to control every situation, and he's in charge. May we trust that this morning. May we walk away with in God's grace and mercy, not as those who are blind spiritually, but instead we have eyes and faith to see. Let's pray. God, we thank you so much for your grace and mercy. We think about just the idea that you would come and love us this much, that you're willing to substitute your own life for ours. That incredible gracious and merciful exchange that we get. It's an incredible deal, but it's more than a deal. It's a pursuit of our lives. And God, I'm so grateful for that Jesus was willing to pay for my sins and our sins. God, I pray that right now, that there may be some who are just questioning those things. And God, I pray in those questions you would meet them right there. God, you'd meet them where they're at, that you would speak to them as I know you're already doing, and that in your grace and mercy you would give them the faith and the courage to respond as you would have them to respond. And perhaps for some of us here, including myself, the worries and the concerns, the unknowns, all those things that are at the forefront of our hearts, God, I pray that we would lay those down too. Just as we trust you with our sin, may we also trust you, God, with our circumstances. And in faith, trust you once again. I thank you so much for your grace and mercy. I pray, God, that you would, and your grace and mercy, you would act swiftly here in our country and in our world, that you would provide an answer to these things. But in the midst of all of that, in the midst of the unknowns, God, I pray you would give grace and you give mercy. We think about all the families who've lost loved ones in the past number of weeks. We pray, God, you, in their grief, God, you would meet with these dear families. At the end of the day, God, we know that you're good and we love you so much. It's in your son's name we're able to pray. Amen. Hey, have a great week. We'll see you next time.